really significant element that's occurring right now in North America is there's an opportunity here for Mexico to join Canada and the U.S. in making a commitment to reducing methane emissions from its oil and gas sector as part of the North American Leaders Summit coming up next week. Now, as I said already, all the reductions that are on the table here for the oil and gas sector from methane emissions are possible with readily available and effective methods and technologies. And where the real value for this action, and this is one of the very unique aspects to methane reductions, is it's possible to get value from taking action. So from the conserved gas, you can actually generate revenue. It's a fairly unique action in terms of a climate change reduction option. And then finally, what we're seeing here is there's a lot of momentum gaining on methane from methane reductions, both at the provincial levels in Alberta and British Columbia, at the federal level in Canada. Then we saw that continue in March with the bilateral agreement between Canada and the U.S. And there's a possibility here for continuing momentum with Mexico possibly joining with Canada and the U.S. on the target. Methane emissions, action on methane emissions has largely been overlooked in the past and hasn't been included in national targets or national reductions. So, a strong commitment from the three North American countries actually would send a really strong global signal that methane reductions are possible. And just finally, one little bit of housekeeping item here. When we're talking about methane emissions, there's sometimes some different terminology used. So sometimes you'll hear people reference to this as leaks or fugitive emissions. And in the context of today's conversation, we're going to talk about the whole, methane emissions will include leaks and fugitives, but it'll also include incomplete combustion, and then it'll also include venting. So we're going to use a broader definition of what methane emissions are than fugitive emissions. So I will hand it over to Drew here to do a little bit of an introduction on some of the challenges in the science side of things.
Great, Duncan, and thank you all for the opportunity to talk about this important issue. So the slide that you have in front of you is a well pad in the Eagle Ford Play here in South Texas, where I'm based. And we did a series of studies where we flew helicopters over oil and gas plays across the U.S. to try to identify what percentage of these sites had visible oil and gas methane emissions. Now, here's the rub with oil and gas. You can't see methane with the naked eye. So if you're just looking at this well pad where you can see kind of in the top left corner, there's the Christmas tree next to two tanks, and then there's a bit of a pipeline that flows across the dirt into those big storage tanks in the top right quadrant of the frame. Everything looks fine and dandy, nothing to see here, no problem. But if you go to the next slide and you use an infrared video camera, in this particular case it was a FLIR camera, you can see that the methane, all of the gas production from this facility is literally pouring out the top of this tank. So this is a bad thing for the company because this is a significant amount of lost revenue that's literally vanishing into thin air. But it's also a bad thing for local air quality because methane is a significant contributor to the volatile organic compounds that form ozone. This Eagle Ford play is downwind of the San Antonio area, which is starting to have a significant amount of air quality impacts from all of the production in this area. But it's also a very bad thing from a climate perspective. And on the next slide, you can see why that is. So the methane is 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. And the fact that methane is the second largest greenhouse gas that exists globally, and 25% of the warming that we're feeling today is due to methane. And we know from global data sets that the oil and gas sector is the largest global source of industrial methane. And as Duncan will talk about later, we also know that it's relatively cost effective to reduce these emissions, making oil and gas methane one of the largest untapped opportunities that exists to reduce the climate change that we're experiencing. And it's not just our opinion as one of the larger U.S. INGOs or the opinion of Pembina, but no less of an authority than the International Energy Agency has called oil and gas methane reductions one of the top 5 things that the global community, actions that the global community can take to reduce global emissions, and went so far as to call failure to act to reduce oil and gas methane as a quote-unquote missed opportunity. And what you can see on the next slide is why people are saying that. So this is a study that was published in the scientific journal Science about a year and a half, 2 years ago now, I think, and looks at different scenarios for what's going to happen to global temperature rise based on greenhouse gas mitigation policies that had been announced at that time. So this is prior to the Paris commitments that started to roll in last spring, summer, and fall. And as you can see, global temperature rise just goes through the roof there and gets to about 4 degrees, which incidentally, the World Bank has said they have no way to model what the impacts on the global economy will be at that level of temperature rise. The next line there shows you what happens to global temperature if you just focus on reducing short-lived forcers like methane. There is a significant reduction in the warming that we feel, but still a long ways to go from where we need to be. A similar trend shows on the next line, which is what happens if you just focus on reducing CO2. And what you find there is that the short-term climate warming that we feel is actually more intense if you just reduce CO2 than if you just reduced short-lived forcers. But the long-term warming is actually less if you just reduce CO2 than if you just reduce short-lived forcers. And that's because, in contrast to methane, which basically disappears from the atmosphere in 100 years, CO2 stays in the atmosphere for millennia. So what this paper has found in this red line here is that really the only way that we can avoid the sort of climate change that science tells us we need to avoid is by reducing both methane and carbon dioxide. And you get the synergies of doing both the short-lived forcers and CO2 mitigation, and you begin to see a path forward for how we can keep global temperature rise to 2 degrees, which was identified in both Paris and the Copenhagen Agreement, but also trying to get to a 1.5 degree goal. So this is why it's important to note that we're not reducing methane in lieu of reducing carbon dioxide, but as an important complement to help reduce the warming that we're feeling today. And I believe, Duncan, that's the last of my slides, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Drew. Now, we just want to give a little context here for what we're talking about in terms of methane emissions in the Canadian context. So on the left here in this slide, you'll see the pie chart shows the overall emissions from the entire economy with the oil and gas sector, the pie there. That's important to note because the oil and gas sector in Canada is actually the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, is the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, has taken over as the #1 sectoral source of emissions from transportation in 2012, and it continues to grow. And largely as a result of the expansion of oil sands production. When you blow up the oil and gas sectoral emissions, we can see that methane is a full third of responsible for a full third of the emissions from the sector. And when we think about how we're going to be able to across the entire economy in all of Canada, how we're going to get reductions to be able to meet our commitment, our 30% reduction by 2030 for the Paris Agreement. In essence, we have to find 208 megatons of reductions. And what's significant here is that you can see that methane is a good is a very sort of stands out as a potential area for easy and quick action to be able to go towards our Paris commitment as a significant contributor to the fastest growing sector in Canada. The next slide here, I just wanted to give a sense, because this is a question we often get from people in terms of, okay, it's nice to be talking about methane emissions in the oil and gas sector, but what exactly are we talking about? And you can see here from the whole supply chain, we go from production from the wells through to the gathering and the processing, the gas plants, and then into the pipelines, into the storage facilities that eventually move the gas into the communities or into the end users for the gas product. And where the emissions come from along this chain come from, three pretty significant areas. And the first one is going back to that term fugitive emissions, and this is unintentional leaks. Although the natural tendency of gas is to want to escape from confined spaces. So along this whole supply chain, gas is trying to find ways to get out, and there's unintentional leaks the whole way. So that includes from flanges and valves and other equipment, etc. Another significant source of emissions is where we have venting of methane directly to the atmosphere, and that's either as a result of equipment design or as part of the operational procedures. So, for example, when in some cases when they're completing a well after they've drilled or they've hydraulically fracked the shale, there's a certain amount of time afterwards where they're going from the drilling and getting the gas to the ground until they're ready to cap it and put it into the transmission lines. Or, for example, when Drew was showing that video of methane emissions coming from Eagle Ford, in that case, Eagle Ford is actually largely an oil play, and the produced gas that's associated with it is not seen as the valuable commodity, so it's allowed to vent to atmosphere, and the players in that particular play don't see the value in terms of capturing the gas. And then finally, the last source of large methane emissions in the oil and gas sector is from actually incomplete combustion. So in this case, you have an engine or a flare that's not working at 100% capacity. So there's actually methane that's passing through the burning and getting emitted into the atmosphere. So we had conducted with EDF and got ICF to conduct an economic analysis of methane reduction opportunities in Canada's oil and gas sector, and we completed that study last fall, which is part of EDF's continuing work to look at the economic analysis for oil and gas and methane emissions across North America. And from that study, we found some very significant results. And one of them was to start off with that we could get 45% reductions from existing proving technologies across the whole gamut of oil and gas methane emissions. So this graph here, this chart you see here, is showing the green reductions are actually positive, or they'll actually be a return on investment for gas storage and gas processing if they were tackling methane reductions. And as you move along from top all the way up to gas transmission, you start to have a cost that's incurred. But again, as I mentioned earlier, in all of these actions, there's actually a mitigation of that cost because they're capturing a valuable commodity. So if we were to take action in here and we're able to achieve this 45% emissions reduction, we would be saving 27 million tons of CO2 equivalent from methane. And going back to putting that in context to our Paris commitment, that would be achieving over 10% of the commitment we've made for the Paris Climate Agreement. The other really significant result from this study was we had a classic 80-20 situation here where there was really concentrated reduction opportunities. So for about 20% of the sources of methane, we could get 80% of the reductions. So there are some very large areas that we could take action and get very significant reductions quickly. And then finally, very significantly again, was the cost for these reductions. So you can see here on this particular chart, when you average that out, it equals $1.33 an MCF for gas, which equals to $2.76 a ton. And when you compare that cost compared to other climate change mitigation options, so for example, we've heard a lot about carbon capture and storage, and that that's potentially looking at $80 to $100 a ton. Renewables are looking anywhere between $15 to $25 a ton in terms of building out the cost of production for that. So we're talking a factor of 10 times less than renewables, almost 20, 30 times less than carbon capture and storage. So a very, very cheap source of reductions. Now, putting this all in the context of what's happening both provincially in Canada and the U.S., first of all, starting in Alberta, and within Alberta's climate plan, we actually have the 45% reduction on methane emissions included in Alberta's climate plan. BC government has made a public commitment that they will meet Alberta's target, and our understanding is there's likely to be an announcement on BC's climate plan coming up here in the next few weeks. We saw in March that Prime Minister Trudeau and President Obama made a shared announcement, and it committed both Canada and the U.S. to a 40 to 45% methane reductions by 2025. For Mexico, leading up to the Paris negotiations on the climate plan, Mexico had actually already identified that methane reductions could be a very significant way for that country to meet their emission reduction goals. And now leading into the North American Leaders Summit, there seems to be this momentum and possibility here of creating a trilateral agreement on methane, and it would be a really a very significant step for the three countries to come forward and make that, both from achieving real reductions in North America and within the oil and gas sector, and creating some regulatory certainty across the three jurisdictions, but also in terms of setting a very strong signal globally that one of the largest emitters for oil and gas methane is taking action on methane reduction. So when we see that here in the context of global emissions from methane, North America is the second largest source of methane emissions. And so, in the context of how that, if globally we could see North America was taking action on that, we know that would be a very strong signal. And for example, in 2009, the three countries got together and actually made a commitment on taking action on hydrofluorocarbons, which is another actually very potent greenhouse gas. And as a result of that leadership by the North American countries, we've actually seen now final action to deliver on a global commitment to reducing hydrofluorocarbons that would result in a 90 gigaton reduction of carbon dioxide, which is a very significant global reduction in terms of emissions. So again, we can see Canada, the U.S., and Mexico have a similar opportunity to lead the international community here in terms of making a commitment to reduce methane emissions by at least 45%. When we look at where we could achieve the deepest cuts, or the deep methane cuts for North America, it's quite remarkable. As I said earlier, in terms of their cost-effective, their proven technologies, but it's actually how simple these changes are that are possible. We're not talking about expensive or unproven technologies. We don't have to make a big moonshot here to develop new technologies and to prove that they're possible. It could be as easy as tightening loose valves and repairing leaky equipment. That'll get us a significant piece of the reduction, up to almost a third of our reduction savings. Again, in routine inspections as part of better management of your assets, so what would be what is best practice by leading companies. If we were able to get all companies to sort of follow those rules, we could see the deep reductions that are possible at, at 45% of current methane emissions in North America. The other very interesting piece on methane, and this is, again, I think quite unique when we look at different areas that we can take action on significant global greenhouse gas, is we actually have support from industry globally. So at a global level, we have the UN Clean Air Coalition and their oil gas methane partnership. 7 significant players who have committed to reducing their methane emissions. And more to the point, in Alberta, we actually have 4 companies, CNRL, Suncor, Shell, and Cenovus, who have committed to supporting Alberta's climate action plan, including the methane reduction goal. So you start to see this is not just simply governments trying to push this out into the industry. Industry is supporting taking action on this, understanding that these are very low cost and proven options for them to be able to meet their reductions. Another aspect to this is we see institutional investors who are calling for a global action on methane and are applauding the action that's being taken in North America by U.S. and Canada on this. So in conclusion here, just wanted again to summarize. I mean, we've seen that through our studies and other group studies is that there are significant reductions are possible. Those reductions are possible from low cost and proven technologies. And we have now this growing momentum amongst provincial governments at federal level in Canada, between the U.S. and Canada, and now and possibly in the North American context for taking action, supported by the progressive leading practitioners at oil and gas companies in the world are also supporting action on methane. So we have an opportunity here to make a significant, to see significant reductions that will contribute to global reductions in greenhouse gases and really show leadership from North America on what it means to take action on oil and gas methane emissions. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Kelly, as I think she may have some questions that have been sent in to her, and we can start there with some questions and comments from our participants.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Duncan. That was great. And Drew. Yeah, so one of the questions that's come in is about since the March announcement of the joint methane target between Obama and Trudeau, it's a question of kind of what's been happening since then. What are the next steps? Where is that sitting now?
Great. That's a good question, actually. So at the federal level in Canada, and I'll talk to Canada, and you can talk to a little bit what the progress has been in the U.S. The federal level in Canada, we know that Environment and Climate Change Canada has been tasked with putting together in short order the regulations that would be necessary to meet the Canada-U.S. agreement. So under the Canada-U.S. agreement, both countries will have in force the regulatory direction by 2017. So the regs may not be enforced by 2017, but there will be laws passed clearly showing that action is going to be taken starting by 2018. So those discussions have started already. Environment and Climate Change Canada has started consulting with industry, with the provincial governments, and with other significant stakeholders. As well as the federal action on meeting that commitment. We've seen now that Alberta has a significant commitment and has started a process in Alberta to plan out what kind of regulatory action it wants to take. And BC is again waiting for the final commitment on terms of what its climate action plan will look like. But our indications are that they see methane as a significant area for action for them in meeting their own climate action goals.
And with regard to the U.S., just briefly on the U.S. side, things are also moving forward here. The United States Environmental Protection Agency has proposed some regulations for directly regulating methane from the oil and gas sector for new sources, and is beginning to collect information for how to regulate those sources from existing sources. On top of that, the Bureau of Land Management, which manages oil and gas operations on federal and tribal land here in the U.S., is moving forward with some regulations for both new and existing. And a number of states have also moved forward for regulations on both new and existing sources. Chief among them would be Colorado, Ohio, Pennsylvania, California, and Wyoming has taken some action that directly reduces methane as a result of regulations for VOCs.
Great, thanks, Drew. So the next question that came up touches on this a bit, but it's a question about what needs to happen next for the regulations to actually be put into place. And is it a case is industry dragging its feet? Is it up to the government now? Like, how do they work together? And yeah, basically, like, what needs to happen for the regulations to actually come to fruition?
Okay, good question. So, there's been, as I said, the federal government is out consulting on the regulations, getting feedback on what they're proposing, and that's including some very good productive conversations with industry, with provinces, and other stakeholders. They're committed to having the draft regulations out by early 2017 for official public comment. And our sense is in Alberta, there's that the Alberta Energy Regulator has been tasked with putting together the regulations that will tackle methane emissions, and their approach is going to be to actually put together industry, leading technology experts, First Nations, and environmental NGO groups, community representatives, and service companies, and put them all in the room and start a discussion and work collaboratively in terms of developing regulations. So, I mean, we've seen government leadership at the federal level. We're seeing participation with that process, and then we're also seeing in Alberta again government leadership and leadership also from industry to participate in this process. In fact, I've heard industry is now is calling for they want faster discussions in Alberta. They want to have more certainty about what Alberta approach is, and they want to get into this multi-stakeholder collaborative process as soon as possible.
Great. Anything else to add to that, or that was a great overview. Thanks, Duncan. And another question that came up here is, so the 40 to 45% federal methane commitment that came up in March, methane reduction commitment, I should say, that came up in March. What does that mean for Canada meeting its reduction targets?
In the sense of reduction targets for Paris, I'm assuming, is that right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm assuming that's regarding the Paris Agreement.
Yeah. And that, again, this is, the 40 to 45% commitment from our research shows that, they could get anywhere from 25 to 30 megatons of reductions. And that would fit, when you think about that, we need to achieve about 210 megatons to meet the Paris commitment of 30% by 2025. Methane reductions, action on methane reductions could achieve 25 to 30 megatons, so over 10% of our overall national goal. That is a significant number. There's not a lot of other reductions that can contribute over 10%, especially from one sector, and especially at the cost that we're looking at anywhere. We had our analysis showing $2.76 a ton. Even if we're going up to $5 or $10 a ton for a reduction, there are no other options out there that compare in terms of that cost. it is simply one of the lowest cost options for meeting our goals.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear that number of 10% of reductions. Like you don't get that kind of clean cut. If we go after this, we'll see this reduction. That's great. Was there anything else to add to that, or move on to the next question here?
Sure, let's move on to another question.
So I've got one more question here. It's, in general, why is methane an important emission for us to focus on, for us to go after?
Sure, I'll pass that a little bit to Drew, and then I'll give some Canadian context, beyond the science on it.
Okay, sounds good.
Well, so I think there's a number of different ways to answer that question. So if you look at the global opportunity for oil and gas methane, if the rest of the world were to reduce its oil and gas methane emissions 45%, which is what the US and Canada said they're going to try to do, it would have the same short-term climate impact as closing 40% of all of the world's coal-fired power plants. So that's a huge opportunity to limit the warming that we're feeling today, if the rest of the world follows the leadership of the US and Canada. Within the Canadian context, some back of the envelope analysis that I've done from the Ivy school that put out a report last fall shows that about 25% of Canada's emissions gap can be filled by reducing oil and gas methane. So again, it's not just a global opportunity, but a significant opportunity for Canada. And it's our view that those two things go hand in hand, that by Canada showing that you can reduce oil and gas methane effectively and efficiently, that will prove to the rest of the world that it's something that they can do as well, and help to drive down those emissions and meet the opportunity that these reductions show.
And I think in the Canadian context, I think the oil and gas sector really understands that methane emissions are within their reductions are within their grasp. The leading companies on this have had this in their sites for years, and some of the companies have investment programs for dealing with methane emissions, and they have been seeing modest returns on those investments, so they understand that there's a business case there. And now, as you see that where the regulatory world is going on methane emissions, there's even a larger incentive here now for taking action, and the costs for it, it's the lowest cost option for the oil and gas sector, and presents itself as a really big part of the solution, a piece of the solution for them there, in terms of showing that they're contributing and trying to tackle the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in the country in terms of the oil and gas sectoral contributions.
Great. So I don't see any other questions coming up from the attendees here. Was there any other final thoughts that didn't come up that you wanted to cover, Duncan and Drew, or are we all set here?
No, it's just really interesting momentum occurring on this file. A lot of us have worked on climate change action for a lot of years, and in my experience, this is the first time that I've seen an alignment between industry, government, and others like Pembina and EDF on the fact that this is a significant reduction opportunity, and that it's something that's within our grasp, it's low cost, and that is a very easy solution to implement. And there's a consensus on that amongst these different players. We're working out the hows and the whats in terms of doing the regulations, but there's not resistance at the scale that we've seen on climate change policy, and there's people looking for implementing this as a real action, real reductions, and it's actually really heartening to see this after many years of feeling like we were struggling to try to get action on this.
Great. Yeah, no, those are great closing thoughts in the lead up to NALS next week. All right, so if there's any other questions, if you want to follow up on anything that we went over today, Duncan and Drew's emails are there. My email is kellyo@pembina.org. And thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Drew and Duncan.
Thanks very much. Have a great day, all.
Everybody.
All right, have a good day.